plus a button. And the way this works is that when you replace the button, the browser gathers all the data in all the input boxes inside the form and sends it to the server. And this form element has a couple of methods, a couple of attributes that describe how that happens. The most important one is this one. It's called the action. The action of a form is a URL, and it's the URL the data will be sent to. So let me demonstrate this. I'm going to write a little bit of code. I don't know if people actually like this, but it's fun for me. Oh wow, this is real cave mode. Oh man, I think I usually leave one of the lights on. Hold on. That one, yeah, okay. We're not that deep into the cave. Too deep. They delve too deep. All right, so let's make a test HTML page. I'm going to keep using this horrible test application. Every semester I say to myself I should plan out a test application running class that will make sense. And then I don't. But just a quick reminder, we have this test application which looks like this. Okay, it lists a bunch of students. I don't know why. So now we want to add a form to this page, and a form is just HTML. So I'm going to go over here and make a little form. So you recall that a form is an HTML element, it's a container element, and what it contains is a bunch of input fields. So student name. Yeah, I know. I can spell, okay? You don't get to this place in life without knowing how to spell, but it's hard. Okay. All right, so here I've defined a little form. It has one input box and it has a button. Now, so far, this form doesn't do anything. If I refresh the page and enter, I don't know, my name, it doesn't seem to do anything when I click the button. But that is because I didn't define this action attribute. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say action equals /add _ student. So remember that the action is a URL. It's just like other HTML elements that have a source equals or an href equals attribute, but this one, for bizarre reasons, is just called something else. Not even one that makes sense. You'd think action would be a verb. It is a URL. Now that I have added this URL, you will see an interesting behavior. When I type in a student's name, we already have that one. All right. Type a student's name in here and click the add button. You will see that my browser has now gone to the URL in question. So the action is a URL. The browser will go to that URL when you click the button. The next thing we need to talk about is how the browser sends the data to that URL. It goes to the URL, it sends data in the form. Let's talk about how that works. The way that works is using those input elements. Oh, let's skip this. Yeah, let's go here first. The way the browser sends data to your server is by looking at those input elements. You've already seen some of these attributes, the type and the ID attribute on input elements, but now we're going to meet a whole lot more. The most important one is this one called name. Every input element with a name attribute is data that's going to get sent to the server when the form is submitted. So let me show you how that works. Let's go back here. So far, exit that. So far, this input element that I've defined does not have a name attribute. And when I click the add button, no actual data is sent because that input element did not have a name. But if I add this attribute by going here, saying name equals student, and refreshing the page, now I have a name attribute. I can type a student's name into here. And then when the page is submitted, you will see that the URL is a little bit funky. It still goes to /add student. Here, I can make this a little smaller. It still goes to add student, but the browser's added a little bit of data to the end. It added a question mark and then student equals Robert. Yes. Yeah, well, we're all out of practice. I forgot to post the slides. You all forgot to remind me. Yeah, well, now we're reminding it. Now I'm doing it. Now I'm doing it. Yeah, I can post the slides. One second, folks. Sorry. Oh. My apologies. I know some people follow along, like on their slides, so I'm gonna post it now. Apologies for the break in the lecture. I'm sure you were in rapt attention, and now it's all broken. I'm not gonna rename it. I'll rename it later. All right. Yes, apologies. Where were we? So what I've done here, I added a name attribute to the input element, and that means that this data will be sent to the server when the form is submitted. Specifically, just to like really put a pin on it, this student portion, that's the name that I gave this input element. And the Robert portion is what I typed in. Again, here, I typed in the word Robert, and the name attribute was student. That's why it submitted student equals Robert. If I instead change the name attribute, then what will be submitted will have that new name attribute instead. This is the core mechanism by which we send data to the server. You create a form on your website, the user fills it out, submits the form by clicking this button. When the user submits the form, the browser looks at every input element inside the form, finds all the ones with a name attribute, gets what the user typed in for that, and sends it to this URL. Yes?
So question.
Yeah.
The way, if I understand it correctly, that's like a key value tag where the name is the key value.
Absolutely. Yep.
So then, like security issues, because you just see the name of it, it's like, it's a password or something like that. Does it like encrypt it?
No. Let's what's a website you might log into that I'm not logged into right now? Facebook. Okay. Now you can see I'm old. I had to sort of Google for the word Facebook. All right. Let's take a look at Facebook. Here is how you would log. Do people still know what Facebook is? Just to clarify. I know you don't use it, but people are aware, right? Okay, good. All right. It's where you buy a cheap car. All right. Hey, I mean, whatever. All right. So here I found this login form. And the first thing you see up here is a form element. And you can see that this form element has an action attribute right here. It submits to /login/. So that looks pretty good. This like privacy mutation token we'll talk about in 2 weeks. And then you can see that there are a bunch of input fields. So like this one right here is your email or phone number input field. And you can see that it has a name equals email. So that means that when you submit this form, the browser will in fact send along whatever you type into here. That's my actual email. And then if you look in here, you'll see the password field. And this one has a name of pass. So whatever you type in here will be sent to the server as well. So I'm going to type in the word password, which is not my actual email. Okay, people. And then let's submit it and see what happens. So I submitted. And we could look at the payload. And here's the form data. Okay, so okay, they really do encrypt something. This is probably some JavaScript stuff. Yeah. No. Because the whole connection, Now, typically you do not. This is some weird Facebook nonsense. Because the whole connection to Facebook should be encrypted, right? So I'm accessing Facebook over HTTPS and it's encrypted. You can see that there's some kind of, this is called connection security. We'll talk about that a little later, but maybe the specific thing to note here is the URL I'm going to has the S in HTTPS, which means all the traffic sent across this connection is encrypted. Like at some point, what the browser is sending is password equals, I mean, whatever, foobar, password, etc. Facebook maybe did some kind of encryption, but don't think too hard about that. The connection that's being sent over, however, transparently encrypts all the data that's being sent across it. Yes, you have a follow-up question.
Yes, so then even with that, when you send it over, is the main way to get that data through the URL, or is there another way?
That's a great question, so we'll talk about that very shortly. So hold on to that thought for like 30 seconds.
If they did encrypt it, would you not be able to find people's passwords in their browser history?
No. We'll talk in a second about not putting the data in the URL directly. But like certainly your browser has access to your password, right? At some point, let's say your password starts with the letter H. You type the letter H. Your browser is the program that like processes that. So like certainly your password is available to your browser. You must assume that your browser is trusted. Even if your password somehow wasn't, like your browser is still the one that's showing you the Facebook page. It could, show you lies if it wanted to, right? So the browser is part of what we're trusting here. The network we don't have to trust because our connection over the network is encrypted when we're using HTTPS. Okay, let me kind of move on with some more mechanics of forms. Okay, so far we've seen this idea that we have input elements. Input elements live inside forms. When you submit a form, we gather all the data in the form, send it in one chunk. I can show you an example with multiple input fields. So let's, I'm going to make sort of a fake password login form. So here I have a super basic login form. I have two input fields, one whose name is username, one whose name is password. I've given this input element a type of password. Remember, that means that when you type into it, it shows up as stars. And I have a button, and I've had it to submit to /login. So again, if I refresh, convenient, it filled out my username and password. I wonder where I got this. When I hit login, it will submit both the username portion and the password portion. It's confusing that these have the same value, but that's just because for this test application, I have the same username and password. If I went back here and said like user and pass, you would see it submitted those. So this is the core mechanism by which you are getting input from the user. You make a form, you outline all the data that you want to receive in one request. User fills out the form, hits the submit button, and that data is sent to the URL you indicate. Okay, this is a fairly complicated process with a bunch of steps. It's important that you remember that. So form, collect all the data, send it together to the URL when the user clicks a button. All right. Now there's a couple of flaws to this process that y'all have already figured out. But the main one is it's pretty dumb to put all this data in the URL, especially with something like a password, because then you really could get that data out of the user's browser history. So we don't actually want that. And that's why there is this second attribute on forms, which is called method. There are two-ish options. That's the web, man. If you want to find out the other options, ask me after class. There's like so many weird and obscure ones. But basically there's two. And conceptually, I want you to think of them as read versus write. The formal names are get versus post. So far, every time your browser has requested a web page and your application has been a get request. Get is, for whatever reason, the browser terminology for a read. You're asking to read individual web pages. But an alternative is called a post request, and that is intended to be for writes. So far, I have not specified the method attribute on this form. That means that so far, don't change it. So far, my browser has been making GET requests. We can actually see that by pressing this button. And then you can see here that login was a GET request. And when you submit a form with a GET request, the assumption is that you're doing something like a search. So you might want to revisit the same results page in the future, and the browser puts all the data into the URL. But there's a lot of cases where we don't want that, like logging in. So in that case, we can explicitly request a post submission instead. If we do that, there will be a couple of changes. First, when I submit the form, I am now doing a post request instead of a GET request. Secondly, the URL does not contain the data. The data instead goes into what's called the payload portion of the request. Yeah. It's sent like this as part of the HTTP request. So it's the same stuff that would go after the question mark in the URL, but it's not put in the URL, it's put in some other part of the request. And there's a couple of other changes. For example, if I attempt to refresh this page, I'll get this weird pop-up. Has anyone ever gotten this weird pop-up before? Yeah, what the browser is doing is it's saying, hey, the page you're viewing right now is the result of a post request. A post request is like a write, it's a modify operation. You may not want to do a modify operation a second time. Like if you say made a bank transaction and you refresh, you do not want to make another bank transaction. Right? And so the browser warns you, it's saying, what does it say this time? It says the page you're looking for used information that you entered. Returning to that page might cause any action you took to be repeated. Do you want to continue? Pretty rude of it to only show one line. Yeah. On the other hand, if I go back to this form, if I make it a GET request, which is the default, then when I submit, if I refresh, the browser is happy to do that. So the browser has this built-in assumption that GET requests, they're safe. Post requests, who knows what they do. And that's actually the main distinction that the HTTP standard talks about. It calls this idempotency, as in, you can assume that you're free to retry a GET request, or if you're a bot, like a search engine, you're free to make GET requests. It's assumed that this isn't bad. It's not going to be a big deal. You can make them multiple times. The web server doesn't care. And then on the other hand, write requests, post requests, the browser's not going to do it, just willy-nilly. It's not going to repeat it without asking you. The search engines won't make post requests, and so on. Okay, so two main types of requests. I have a little quiz here. Well, not really a quiz. I got a bunch of different forms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 forms that I found by just, using the internet. So I wanted to talk through which of these are GET forms, which of these are post forms. So this first one on top, it's the search mail button in Gmail. So we want to think through, if you do a search a second time, is that going to change any state on the server? Is that going to have permanent effects? We don't think it will. So probably you want this search form, you want that to be a GET request. Or if we look at this go to file button in GitHub. Again, if you type in something different, if you type in a file, if you go to a file twice, you refresh the page, etc., you don't expect that to make any changes to your repository on GitHub. So again, we expect this to be a GET request. On the other hand, here's the form for committing on GitHub. And it actually is meaningful to do 2 commits versus 1 commit. That does change some kind of state that someone cares about. For example, you might need to pull on your repository locally. So this here ought to be a post form. Here we've got a search form in Gmail. This is a pretty complicated form. You can see it's got quite a number of text entries. There's a number entry here. There's some drop downs of various kinds. This is a date entry. I think this is also a drop down, and there's some checkboxes. So this whole form here, this is the advanced search interface in Gmail. again, we don't expect this to actually make changes when you submit it. We expect that when you hit the search button, you'll go to a different page, it'll show you search results, but it's okay to repeat that search. So again, that case is a get form. On the other hand, this is the add calendar event form in Google Calendar. They're a Google product, so I just switched to my email and I found all these forms. So here, you expect that adding a calendar event, this is actually making some changes. It might even like send emails to people or something. So again, this is a post form. So two different types of forms, get forms and post forms. Get forms are for read-only stuff. The best example of these is searches of various kinds. Here you have data from the user, but you're not making any changes. You're just finding different information. And then post forms are anything that make changes, like adds, removes, edits, that kind of thing. Okay? Questions so far? Yes.
Remember a scenario where it'd be both read and write?
Yeah, I mean, there's some weird cases, like a good question is, what does this create filter button do? If you click it, because like create a filter sounds like it's modifying something, but it is in the same form. Maybe we'll get an answer to that question. No, I'm not going to bring up my email in front of students. Just kidding. We're not answering that question. Yeah. I think what I would say is like, yes, there's all sorts of situations where you might want to like do some searching and then some modification sort of simultaneously. The underlying technology of the web does not like that. I mean, I suppose you would default to a post, right? Because like you don't want search engines accidentally making modifications. You don't want users accidentally doing it twice or something like that. Yeah, so you can like default to post, but like broadly people don't do that because the technology does not match it. I think one thing I should say about get forms is I use this example of just like refreshing the page after submitting a form. This is probably not super common, though it's common enough that you've all seen the pop-up. But one that's super important is that on your phone, if you open enough tabs or you have a cheap enough phone, then your browser can't actually store all those tabs in memory. And what it'll do is it'll just delete it will throw away memory corresponding to old tabs. And if you click on the old tab, it'll reload that page. So this is an example where it really matters whether or not it's okay to like reload the page from scratch. So if that's a post submission, your browser will like show a warning just like the one you just saw. So there are natural reasons why user might be correct. All right, cool. So the sort of summary of how forms work. When you're making a form, you're going to collect all the data that you want from the user, like all of it that together you're going to process in a single form. For each of those, you're going to have an input field, and you're going to pick a name attribute for that input field. You should also probably put a label so the user knows what's in it. And then at the bottom of the form, there also has to be a button. And the user is going to click on that button when they're done filling in all of the forms. Then that form has an action attribute, and that tells you the URL to which that data will be sent. And then the last thing you think about is, do you need this method attribute? Do you want a get or a post submission? I've done checklists before, but this is, I think, the longest one. So there's a lot of moving parts to the form. You're probably going to want to return to this as you're working on homework 4 just to make sure you've got all the steps. Okay, but you can remember what these steps are for. All the data goes in a form because when the user submits the form, the browser will ship only the stuff inside the form. You need the single form element to contain all the inputs you want. Each input element needs a name attribute because that's the key in the key value pair that the browser sends you. You need a label so the user knows what to type into the field. You need a button because that's what the user clicks to submit the form to your server. You need an action because that's the URL the data will go to. And finally, you need the method that's either going to be get or post. Yes.
So what if you have multiple forms on one page? So like on Gmail, you have the search bar and then you're composing an email.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's add a form at the top. Action is going to be students search. And it's gonna allow you to search for a specific student. So here I'm gonna put student, I wrote this form earlier, should have just not deleted it. Name equals student. And here I'm gonna put search button. And then down here, I'm gonna say. And the student is gonna have a name and unit. I think that's what was in our model. So this one's gonna go to students add. So I got two forms. The form on top, that's a get form because there's no method attribute. And that submits to /students/search. The form at the bottom is a post form. It submits to /students/add. So let's look at what happens when we do that. I've now got a form at the top and a form at the bottom. This one's pretty ugly, but please ignore that. In the search form at the top, I could say search for J. If you want to find all the students with a J in their name. And you can say I went to students/search, student equals J. Note that it did not send the unit or the student name from the second form because I didn't submit the second form. I submitted the first form. And so it went to the URL associated with the first form. It used a GET request because the first form wanted to use a GET request, and it sent just this student input box. So again, this URL, GET form, which is the default, only this input box. If I go back and I fill out this form instead, don't know your unit, and I hit this button, now you will see that we made a post request to students/add. And that's because the second form wanted a post request to students/add. And it sent a name and a unit. And you can see here form data, name and unit. So if you could have multiple forms and whichever form you hit the button in, that form's data is going to be what's submitted, and it's going to go to that form's URL, and it's going to use that form's method. Other questions about writing forms? Yes.
Let's
Alan?
confirm something on the action attribute. You said that,
It's a
oh,
URL.
sorry, not the action attribute. I meant the input label has an attribute name.
Yeah.
Does that use the exact name of a data field used in the database?
No, you could put whatever. I mean, like for sanity's sake, you should probably put something related to the field in the database. But this is used just for communication between your browser and the server. On the back end, you can choose your code to do whatever you want.
Like,
What is ink type or ANC type?
Yeah, okay, great. Hold that thought for a second.
What, wanted to include the time and date of when something was submitted?
That's a great question. You can't, I mean, by which I mean, there's no built-in method for the browser to send you its time and date. Now, when the browser submits the form, just like when the browser makes any other request to your server, your code on your server runs, and it can grab the time and date in the server. If you want like a user submitted time and date, you can have a time or date input field, right? So, you know, that would be fine. We'll also talk, like in a week and a half about hidden input fields. Maybe that's what you're thinking about, but like, if you want the time something happened, then your code running on the backend can ask what's the current time. Yes.
So say you're submitting an assignment at 11:59 PM. Does it go off of like the server time or the time off of your browser?
I'm confident it uses the server time, because
Okay.
the other thing is, we'll talk about this next week when we start talking about security. But the browser is code running on my machine. You can't trust me. You can't trust your users' browsers. For one, maybe they're running like a really old version of Internet Explorer. Okay, and it's been like hacked. Or maybe they are North Korean hackers. I mean, that's also a possibility, right? You don't know who your users are. If you're thinking in terms of security, you know, if you want something like the current time, you can't trust what the user's browser did. Because the user browser works for the user, not for you. Right? You got to focus on, you know, what server side time is available. Yes, this means that if you finish your assignment at 11:59:59 and 999 milliseconds, and you hit submit, but then by the time the request crosses the network, all the way to, man, I guess it's like 3 miles south to the instructor offices. And by the time it gets there, it's already the next day, then yeah, your assignment probably shows up as submitted late. And if you give this excuse to your professor, I expect them to be not impressed. All right. Cool. There's one more kind of weird quirk that I wanted to throw in here, which is this weird ink type attribute. This is not super commonly necessary, but there's something weird you have to do with it if you need to allow for file uploads. I'm not even going to tell you what weird thing you have to do with it. Just look it up. But the important thing I want you to remember is that if your form needs a file upload, so an input type equals file or input type equals image, then you're going to need this ink type attribute. And then there's just some weird string that you put in there. You will need this for your home. All right. A couple of other random things on an input form that are useful to show. One is the value attribute. So I said before that when I submit a form, the browser submits whatever I've typed in here. When we talk about what I have typed in here, you might be wondering where that lives. Where it mostly lives is an attribute called value. So if I start this with value equals J, then you will see a J show up here. If I type Jason, then you see the word Jason show up here. So what I have typed into the box is actually the value attribute of that input element. So what the browser is actually doing when you submit, it's finding every input and writing name equals value for every input in that input box. There's a couple of other input fields that I have here. One that's pretty useful is disabled. You can put this on any input box and it just disables it. And it's also sometimes helpful to have a placeholder, which is what to show if the user hasn't typed anything in. So for example, here, student, you know, just give people an example of what they're gonna, oh, I didn't put that in the right place, did I? Placeholder equals studentovich. And this gives people an idea, maybe, of what they should be typing in to the input box. Sometimes people put the label in the placeholder instead. Don't do that. There's a label and there's a placeholder. So the placeholder is like example data of some kind. Similarly, if you had a date field, it might be convenient to show like what example date format you want people to use. Or like, if I wanted the student's telephone number for some reason, so I can call them in the middle of the night, remind them their homework is due. If I just have a telephone input field, you'd be a little confused like what formats are acceptable. So maybe I do like placeholder equals 15555 505. And I have some idea of what they're supposed to do.
Is there an easy default thing to do to make the phone number be formatted with like the +1,
There. Okay, the true answer is yes, but it's weird and complicated. So don't bother. Or like look it up, right? So, you know, anything that I mentioned in class that I'm like, I'm not going to talk about it further because it's like obscure and not all of you will need it, and I have a finite amount of time in class. What you can always do is go to the input element on MDN, and it's a really long page because there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do. You know, there's all these like input types that I didn't talk about, like weak. What a weird input field. And then there's also a whole lot of attributes that I'm not telling you about, like capture, if you want the user to be able to take a photo with their webcam. And then if you go down here, you'll see all sorts of different stuff that you can do, like form validate, for validation and all sorts of things. So you can always look up sort of additional documentation. The web platform is massive. About 20% of it is terrible ideas and like 80% of it is just obscure things. Well, I guess some things are good ideas, but mostly like weird obscure things for use cases that I don't have time to mention. All right, so yeah, I should also mention, besides input elements, there's a couple of other HTML elements that provide like other controls. So like drop downs use this thing called select. We're not going to really touch them in this class, so let's skip this slide. Let's move on to what happens on the back end once the data is submitted. Okay, so far we've been submitting this form. So maybe let's start with this student name search. Okay, so far when I submit the form, all I get is a page not found warning. So that's pretty dumb. Let's fix that. You know that the starting point to adding a URL to Django is to go to our favorite URLs field. So here we're trying to go to students/search. So let me add students/search. And now I need a view as in a controller for that. So I'm going to call it students search. And now I can go into my views file and add this controller. So students search request. Here's the first place that I want you to not get confused. The URL does not have any parameters, right? The URL is students/search. So I don't have any parameters here. Sometimes there's going to be cases where you want to submit to a parameterized URL. For example, in your homework assignment, you're going to want to upload a submission to a particular assignment. In that case, in your URLs, you would have something like, int assignment/submit. And then, because I have int assignment, then I would define the controller with right? But just because we're submitting data does not mean that this function gets additional arguments. These arguments here, they're about the URL. Request is like all the parts that don't change, and then you get another one for every part. So now if I refresh this page, I'm going to get a different error message. I'm going to say this view did not return an HTTP response object. So let's work on that next. We know that if we want to return an HTTP response object, we're going to need to add a template. So let's call it search.html. And we'll make it real simple. Your search yielded results length result otherwise. Just trying to refresh your memory about how templates work. And then we're going to have a for loop here. I don't know, we're going to go real lazy. Let's for results in results. Results.name. I hope students have name fields. And for and you don't have to, but it's nice to put it close. So now I want to render this template. We know how to do that. We have to return render request search.html. And now we need to provide a value for the results variable. So one thing, of course, we could do is we could just render all students. And if we do that, it does work, but it didn't successfully find the students with a J in their name. Right? We're not actually making use of the user's input at all, because I haven't told you how to do that. But now I will. So now we want to get some of the data that was sent to us by the browser. The way you do that differs based on whether it's a GET or a POST request. if it's a get request, this one is a get request. So the data lives in request.get. Pretty straightforward. It's all caps. Request.get is a dictionary. It maps those same key value pairs that the browser sent you. So you're gonna end up looking at multiple templates at a time. Here's the template with the form submission we are receiving. It has name equals student. That means that in this second controller, in this controller, we're gonna get a get submission for student. Make sense? So this form defines the key. This key is submitted by the browser to this controller, and that controller can get it out of request.get. Note that in principle, you could have multiple different forms on different web pages, all submitting to the same controller. And this might make sense. You might want every single page on your website to have a search field of some kind. But typically, every different form, every different kind of form is going to submit to its own unique URL. And then that unique URL will use the names that that form contains. Yes.
Do we need to like create it to store it in the database? Like doc create? So like,
Well, here this is doing a search. So I think what we're going to want to do with this student name part is we want to search the database for students with that in the name.
oh,
So what we might do here, let's extract this.
so Post puts it in there without having to like create the objects with that data that you're saying?
We're going to talk about post requests in a second.
Oh, okay.
So far, we're doing the search form, which is a get request. I'm starting with get requests
All right. because
it's a little more clear what's happening because the data is in the URL. So here we have the student name part that we want to search. Let's just filter to name contains equal student name part. Okay, so now I'm filtering to the students that contain whose name contains the user's submission. And if I refresh this page, you'll see that this worked. We are now filtering to students with just the letter J in their name. And this isn't super important for demonstrating this, but I just wanted to show. You might also want to pass what the user's what the user searched for back into the template. So here I can say student name part, your search. And I don't know, you can even put it in some kind of HTML element. I didn't teach you the KVD element, but that's what it sounds like. So here, now we have the search inside our template. I guess I'm missing a comma.
Wait, what does it sound like?
What?
I don't get it. What does it sound like?
It's what you type with your keyboard.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, KVD for keyboard. Yeah, sorry, I should have elaborated. Right, yeah. Okay, so we built a little search form. This search is not super impressive. It does a substring match, but it is doing some kind of search. Now let's get to the other case where we want to do this student add form. Okay, in the student add form, we're getting the student's name, the unit. Okay, that's kind of weird. Let's not collect their telephone number. So now we want to add this one. We go back to our URLs page. Now we need to add support for students/add. As usual, we are going to define a controller. This URL is also not parameterized, so there's no additional attributes. There's no additional arguments to the method. And now we want to get out the student's name and unit. So let's get student name, student unit. And now that we have a get submission, we will use post instead of get. That's the only difference. And we'll stick name and unit in here. Okay. So we can get the data that the user submitted. It's the same way. It's just that we use post instead of get. There's a quirk to this. If you have file uploads, then there's a whole nother one called request.files. But Everything that's not a file upload goes in Post. Now we want to do something with this name and unit. We want to add a student. So let's do models.student.create. I'm going to refresh my memory of what our models look like here. Ah, a student has a name and a unit, very convenient. Okay. So name equals student name, unit equals student unit. And just a reminder, if you use create, you don't have to save it afterward, but you can also do this and then do student.save. I know. So now we've updated the database. We still, however, need to return something to the browser. For a post request, what you typically want to do is not render a template, but instead redirect the user. So here I'm going to add a field. I'm going to use a shortcut called redirect, and this just takes a URL. So here, maybe let's redirect to students/search. There's what is it? Is it like /hello? There's some garbage other review that we added here. Yeah, hello. Hey. What you're often going to be doing is you're going to be redirecting to a URL that uses the student, the ID of the object you just created. If you have like a view for like an individual student. So let's see this work. I'm now going to fill up this bottom form. Student image. Unit, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That seems good. I'm gonna hit add student. Oh yeah, this thing. Yeah, when you're at a post form, you'll inevitably hit this, and then you gotta add this bit to your post form. I'll explain what this actually does in 2 weeks. But you copy and paste that little bit of code into your post form. Yes.
But we do need to do.
You do need to do that. Otherwise, you'll get that error message that I just got. That wasn't planned, but I get it every single time I do it. So let's try again. Student image 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Add students. And now I have successfully added student image to the form. Yes.
Can you show again where you put that?
Literally anywhere inside the form element. Yes. Okay, so now we've built a search form. I can search for Vitch. Find all my homies. There's student to Vitch. And then alternatively, I can add new students, and that works too. You saw it. Okay, questions? Yes.
So validating required that front end of that.
That's a great question and the topic of all of Wednesday. So hold on to your horses for 2 days and we'll get to it. Validating what people submit in the form is super important. And a big part of making forms like actually usable for people. So I've got a whole lecture on that. Good thought process. Other questions? So just a reminder of the process here. What we did to make the form work in Django, we added a URL to urls.py to route that form action to a specific controller. Then we create a view function for that controller in views.py. And then in there, you can get the get and post fields. One thing I note here is that it is a good idea to restrict controllers that handle post requests to only handling post requests. So I have a little bit on how to do that here. I think it is, I guess I'll look up u from Django.use.decorators. I think that's right. Is it right? .http. Okay. So what I can do for a form submission, since we're expecting to only receive post requests, it is often a good idea to do that. All of this does is it will make Django throw an error if you accidentally do a get submission to this URL. And the reason you might want to do that is A, you might mess up your form, and it's good to get an error message and fix it. And also, a GET request is the kind of request you make when clicking links as well. So if a user accidentally gets a link to this URL for some reason and goes to it, you don't want that processed like a form submission. You don't want to like accidentally create objects in the database or something, just because someone like went to a weird URL. So I think if I go directly to student/add, students, right, student/add. I'm just getting an error message here. I think 405 is probably wrong method. Let's find out. Yeah, it says 405, method not allowed. So again, this is a small thing. This is just there to make sure that, you know, I'm definitely not going to process things that aren't like proper form submissions. All right. And then inside this request handler, we're going to access request.get and request.post. These are dictionaries that use the same exact key value pairs that the browser sends you. So it's a map from this name attribute that you defined when you wrote the form to whatever the user typed in. And again, it's only the stuff in the form, right? So the form has to store all the data that you want to process at the same time. So for example, if you're creating some kind of object in the database, then that's going to work by you want all the fields needed to create that object. And so you're going to need a form with all those fields. Like in this case, we're going to need both the student name and the unit because we want both of them to create. I have a note at the bottom saying checkboxes are kind of weird. So I think that's all you really need to know. You can look up the details of how these are submitted, but basically checkbox, instead of having a string value, it will be there or not based on whether or not the user checked it. Yeah. Questions about processing form submissions in Python code?
You might not remember this, but is there a way to reroute the user after they input the form?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'm doing here, right? So when we submit the request, I get data from the request by accessing request.post, put it into like normal Python variables. Then I do some kind of like database action, say save it to the form, or maybe you can edit an object. And then at the very end, you're typically going to redirect to some other page. Now, there's two reasons for this redirect. First of all, now that you've added the data, probably the user wants to see it. And you probably already have a page on your website that lets you view a database object. So you might as well just redirect them there. And the second reason is the post request is weird, right? Users can't refresh it. You know, the browser thinks it's special. This redirect is gonna make the browser do a GET request to some other page, which is like normal. And then the browser will remember that and they can refresh that page as well.
Can you show the tag you added to the form one more time?
Yeah. The important thing to remember is that it'll be in the error message. The error message will have like some paragraph at the bottom and it'll have a bunch of bullet points about how you can fix it. And the first one will say copy and paste this bit into your form. We'll talk about what that means. I believe in your homework assignment, I explicitly tell you to add it so that you don't forget. Okay. So let me show you one more form example, because this is a real world case you'll do a lot of. We've created an add form. What we don't have yet is an edit form. What if I input someone's unit or their name incorrectly? So let's go through the process just as practice of creating one more view, which is going to be an edit form for the student. Okay. So I'm going to start on this page. I want an edit form. I want there to be an edit button over here that I could go to edit the student's information. So we're going to start by going to that form. It's this template right here. Here's the table that we're looking at. And you can see that right now it is a table row with a single cell, the student's name. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add another cell. This one is going to be a link that says edit. And I'm gonna link it to /student/student.id/edit. So what I'm doing here is this URL encodes which student I want to edit. Okay? So now if I refresh this page, you will see an edit button. And if I click on this edit button, you will see I've gone to student/1/edit because I want to edit the student with ID 1. If I click on student image, that's student ID 8. And so that's encoded in the URL. Now I want to make this page show an edit form. So let's do that. I'm going to start at URLs. I'm going to define student/ID/edit use.student_edit. So because the URL that I am going to is parameterized, this URL is also parameterized by the student ID. And now I'm going to go to views and define a student edit controller. Remember that I'm going to put the URLs over here. Remember that my URLs right here are parameterized, so this controller is also going to get a student ID parameter. Okay? So we're going to want this to render some kind of template. So let's just write that right away. Let's call it edit.html. And we don't know what data we're going to pass yet, so let's just do that. And then naturally, we're also going to need to define an edit.url.html. So let's do that. Stick the doc type HTML at the bottom. And edit student. Okay, so we're going to need to know the student's name. So in this controller, I'm going to look up that student. I'm going to say student equals models.student.objects.get ID equals. You will note that this whole exercise is partly a sneaky way to like refresh your memory about how Django works in general. Because I know it before. Okay, so now if I refresh this page, and server went down. It says, did you forget a comma? Sure did, probably. Yeah. All right. Cool. So now if I click on edit right here, it says edit students. Okay. But this page should actually show an edit form. So let's work on that next. We're going to need a form. And editing is our write operation. So I know that it's going to be a post form. And I haven't yet written an edit controller. So let me just make up a URL. I'm going to say action equals /student/student.id/edit. Funny enough, that actually is the exact same URL that this page will be served from, and that's a common pattern that you'll see. You'll often have a post form resubmit to the same URL that it is currently on, which is fine. You'll just use the same controller, and then you can branch on whether it's a post request. Okay, so let's actually build out the form. The first thing we're going to want is we're going to want it to be possible to change the student's name. So input name equals name, type probably text is fine. And importantly, since it's an edit form, we already have a value for the student's name. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put student.name inside this value attribute. And what that means is that this input field will be pre-filled with the student's name as currently in the database. So we can close the label. And then we'll do the same for the unit. And at the bottom of the form, we're going to need a button. And I'm going to think ahead. and we have to do this weird thing that Django requires you to do. Again, it can go literally anywhere in the book. Okay, so now we've added a form, and you can see it actually pops up right here with name and unit. Immediately I noticed something weird. Some students in the database don't have a unit, apparently it's optional. And as a result, it's printing the word none as the unit. That doesn't really sound right, especially since we probably want to restrict this to be a number. So we'll probably need to do something like if student unit. Actually, we can do pipe default. None. Okay. So now we have a little edit form as well. It looks pretty ugly and that's bothering me. So let's stick some divs. All right. That'll work. There we go. Okay, so now we have a save form. Now, if I change it to 1, 2, 3, 4, I know that's not even 4, and save it, it doesn't yet do anything. That's because if we look at the networks toolbar, we have made a post request. We have made a post request to student/4/edit with a payload of the name and the unit plus some nonsense that CSRF token thing did. And because it was to student/4/edit, that went to views.studentEdit, which is this short method that we've written here, and that doesn't do anything like saving to the database or anything like that. Okay, so what we're going to want to do here is something like if request.method is post. We're going to want to add some code in here to actually save that data to the database. So let's do that. It's going to work a lot like the student add form did. We're going to pull out this name and unit field from that form. But instead of creating a new student, we're going to want to edit the existing one. So we're going to say student.name equals student name. Student.unit equals student unit. And here I've stuck in an or none. What that means is that if the student unit is the empty string, I just want to say none. And actually, well, we're going to get an error, so we'll look at that. And finally, now that I've modified the student, there's one more very important step. We need to save the student. Modify the student object doesn't do anything until you call save. Only by calling save do you actually send the results back to the database. Okay, and now if we've successfully modified, I suppose we'll probably want to redirect. I don't really have anywhere to redirect to, so I'm just going to redirect to the same page. Python has these f strings where I can do this note, single curly brace instead of double curly brace, and we return it. So now this should actually work. I should be able to type in a number. Let's start with just changing. It's probably not our last name. I'm just sticking a letter in. And now it modifies. I can submit again. That'll modify again. Questions so far? Yes.
Can you use patch for, isn't patch for edit usually or no?
Realistically, no.
Really? It's
Yeah.
just like conventional if that,
Yeah,
It used to
yeah. I
be.
mean, good ideas that did not work. The
okay,
web is-
gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. One last thing I want to point out. Let's suppose I did type in a unit into here and hit save. That actually works really fine. Okay, maybe there's not much to check. What if I typed in? Yeah. Okay, so that is surprising, but I guess what it means is that I remember that the value inside this dictionary is a string. So student unit right here is a string. I suppose what's happening is Django is automatically converting that to an integer. That could be bad because if I typed in something weird in the form, for example, if I went to this form, told it that it's no longer a number, and typed in the word, I don't know, hello into the unit and hit save, now I would get some kind of exception. And that's fairly common. We'll talk about validation of these forms on Wednesday, and that'll be kind of our last topic on this. So, just to kind of review, form handling. You define the controller can read from request.post. It'll do any kind of conversions, modify the database, save any objects. So here, create an object and save it, for example. And then at the very end, what it'll do is it'll redirect to another URL. Okay, cool. And we'll talk about the rest of this on